Okay, guys, so this is Quin and quominus. They're pretty weird words, and the reason that they're tricky is that they don't really have their own version in English. So whenever we spot them in Latin, the best rule to follow is what's going to make sense here. But there are a few pointers that I'll just show you now that will kind of make things a little bit clearer. So make sure you're writing these down in your notes. We're on page 86 of the textbook, and we're going to start with Quin. Okay, and there are some translations up at the top here that would be useful for Quin. So it can mean from, without, that, who, not. So obviously just at first glance there you can see it's a little bit complicated because that's a lot of different translations. Quin will usually appear after a negative main clause. So the previous clause will have non or nemo or nihil or something like that in it. But there's two different ways in which it can be used. The first way it can be used is as a pronoun, as you can see here. And this is the less common use of Quin, but it still happens. So you can see it turns up here after this negative nemo. So nemo erat, pretty straightforward, there was no one. And then because it's being used as a pronoun, we then translate it as who did not praise the wisdom of the king. Now you can see there we've got who did not as our translation of Quin. So that's this option up here. When Quin is being used as a pronoun, its usual translation will be who not. Okay, so that's not the clearest rule to follow, but if you think it is being used as a pronoun, then use that and see if it makes sense. Okay, so when Quin is a pronoun, this means that in the main clause you've got a negative, but also Quin itself is being used negatively. So not just translated like qui, but translated as a kind of negative form of qui. Laudare, you can see there, is subjunctive. That's because if you think about this clause, the whole thing is a generic subjunctive. It's saying that there wasn't the sort of person who might praise the wisdom of the king. So that's why laudare there is imperfect subjunctive. Okay, so that's Quin as a pronoun, meaning who, not. We're now going to look at Quin used as a conjunction, which is the more common use of Quin. You can see here I've got 3 different examples. Again, this will come after a main clause which is negative. So you can see here we've got a negative, here we've got a negative, and here we've got a negative. And then usually when Quin's used as a conjunction rather than a pronoun, you can just translate it as that. So this first example, cives non dubitant quin hostes oppugnatori essent, we translated Quin here as that. The citizens did not doubt that the enemy were going to attack. So the difference between Quin as a pronoun and as a conjunction is that when it was a pronoun, it was translated negatively. Whereas as a conjunction, it's just translated as that. There's no not involved in the second part. There is a negative in the main clause, but there's not a negative when you come to the translation of Quin. Okay, the second example here, latro non negavit quin ipse senem necaviset. The robber did not deny that he himself had killed the old man. So again, it's negative in the main clause, but when it's a conjunction, you're just translating it as that rather than anything negative. And then the third example, nihil me impedit quin tecum veniam. Now this one's a little bit different. Nothing hinders me from coming with you. So here we've translated Quin as from. Now, Quin, as well as following a negative main clause, there's particular verbs that it's quite often going to appear after, and they are verbs, if you look at those examples, you can kind of spot them. Verbs of doubting, verbs of denying, and verbs of hindering. Okay, so all kind of wobbly negative verbs. When it comes after a verb of doubting or denying, like dubito and nego, it's usually translated as that. But when it comes after a verb of hindering, preventing, impeding, like impedio here, then you translate it as from, like we did in that third example. But as I say, the kind of best rule to follow is what's going to make most sense here. But just make sure that if you are translating it as a conjunction, you're not translating it as negative like you would if it was a pronoun. Okay, the next one that we are going to meet, which has similarities to quin, is quominus. Okay, so new set of notes on this little guy. Okay, so here's an example sentence. So you've got your quominus here. Now note that in the main clause, there is no negative here, and this is the key difference between quin and quominus. Quin requires the main clause to be negative, whereas quominus doesn't. But it's translated in a very similar way. And the sort of verbs that it appears with are also very similar. So you can see here we've got a verb of impeding, of hindering, of preventing. There's no negative in the main clause. So my brother prevented me, and then we're translating quominus here as from going to Rome. So exactly the same as we translated quin after impedio earlier. The only final little annoying rule to add to your notes is that quin can follow something called a virtual negative, okay? So what we mean by that is words like vix, scarcely, okay? This is a virtual negative. So in this sense, it can almost try and be a little bit pally with quominus, in that it doesn't necessarily need like non, nihil, nemo. It doesn't need a really solid negative always in the main clause. You could just have a word like scarcely or hardly. Basically, if it's a statement that kind of expect something not to happen. So if this were a question, it would expect the answer no. Or if you're describing something, it sounds like something has barely happened, then you're looking at quin rather than quominus. Okay, so there's no hard and fast rule for these two words. It isn't just see this word, translate it as this. Quite often you will translate it as that or from. And remember, it will be translated negatively. Quin will be translated negatively if it's being used as a pronoun. So you need to consider whether this is a conjunction or whether this is a pronoun. The most common use of both of them, though, is a conjunction where you're translating it either as that or as from.